The dessert hit the table at 9:47 p.m. Nobody planned it. Nobody authorized it. And in a restaurant where every detail was controlled down to the temperature of the serving plates, an unauthorized dessert reaching the wrong table was the kind of mistake that ended careers. But that night, it ended something far bigger than a career. Jang Dujin sat at the private corner table the way he always sat, spine straight, expression unreadable, the kind of stillness that made the air around him feel heavier than it should. He had been in the middle of a conversation with two business associates when the plate arrived. The server placed it down quickly, nervously, the way all the staff moved around Dujin, like they were defusing something. He glanced at the dessert. A soft ivory cloud of cream, drizzled with something dark and amber. The scent reached him before he even leaned forward. Something warm. Something that didn't belong in a city like Los Angeles. Something that smelled like distance and memory and an old kitchen somewhere he had never been. He picked up the spoon. One bite. Silence. His two associates continued talking. Then they noticed. The man who never paused had paused. The man who never softened had softened, just slightly, just at the corners of his eyes, just enough for the people who knew him to feel the temperature in the room shift by 3 degrees. He took another bite. Then he set the spoon down with unusual care and looked up at the nearest server. Who made this? The server blinked. Chef Lim prepared the...
No.
Dujin's voice was quiet. It was always quiet. That was the part people misunderstood about him. He never needed to raise it. This was not made by Chef Lim. Chef Lim has been making the same creme brulee for 4 years. This is something else entirely. So I will ask again. Who made this? The server's mouth opened, then closed, because the honest answer was sitting somewhere between impossible and humiliating. The dessert had been made by the woman who washed the dishes. If something about this story already feels like it's pressing against your chest, that's not an accident. That's recognition. The kind of thing that happens when a story is true even when it's fiction. If you feel it, don't sit quietly. Subscribe now and stay close, because what happens next in this restaurant will change every person in it, and the smallest voice in the building will be the loudest thing Dujin has ever heard. Her name was Amina Bello. She was 34 years old. She had arrived in Los Angeles 5 years earlier from Kano, Nigeria, carrying 2 suitcases, a folder of nursing qualifications, and the absolute certainty that her life was about to begin. The nursing board disagreed. Her qualifications needed reevaluation, re-examination, recertification. The process would take 18 months and cost money she didn't have. So Amina did what dignified people do when the doors close in their faces. She found a window. She applied for cleaning work, then kitchen prep, then dishwashing. The restaurant industry in Los Angeles did not ask about nursing credentials. It asked whether you could stand for 8 hours and keep your mouth shut. Amina could do both. She had been working at Oro Nero, Dujin's flagship restaurant in downtown LA, for 14 months. She arrived before the kitchen opened and left after it closed. She was invisible in the way that hardworking people become invisible when the people around them are too busy performing busyness to notice real labor. The chefs didn't learn her name until month 3. The manager still occasionally called her the dish girl, which Amina had stopped correcting because correcting it required energy she needed for other things. Like surviving. Like raising Samir. Samir Bello was 10 years old and the sharpest person in any room he walked into, which was either a gift or a problem depending on how you looked at it. He had come to live with Amina 2 years earlier after her brother and sister-in-law died in a road accident in Lagos. Amina had not hesitated. There was no deliberation, no weighing of options. He was her brother's child. He was hers now. Full stop. Samir was small for his age and quiet in a way that unsettled adults because most children his age were loud. His silence wasn't timid. It was focused. He watched things. He cataloged things. He had a composition notebook with a brown cover that he carried everywhere, and he wrote in it in a handwriting so precise it looked like it belonged to someone twice his age. The notebook had begun as a homework journal. It had become something else entirely. But we'll get there. Every night after Oro Nero's kitchen closed, Amina did something she told no one about. While the other staff collected their bags and disappeared into the Los Angeles night, Amina stayed behind. She had permission to clean the kitchen after hours. It was part of an informal arrangement with the night manager who appreciated that she never needed supervision. What the night manager didn't know was that Amina wasn't just cleaning. She was baking. Not for profit. Not for approval. Not because she had any plan or ambition attached to it. She baked because her grandmother, Hajia Rakia, had taught her to bake in a kitchen in Kano that smelled of groundnut oil and harmattan dust, and the recipe she kept returning to, the one she had memorized at age 11 while standing on a wooden stool, was something Hajia Rakia called Zuma Tamarind Cloud. Honey Tamarind Cloud. It was not a famous dessert. It was not in any cookbook. It was a family recipe that had been passed down quietly through women who understood that the act of feeding someone something beautiful was a form of prayer. Amina made it because Los Angeles felt enormous and cold, and the smell of honey and tamarind and cardamom made it feel smaller. Made it feel like somewhere she belonged. She had never planned for anyone to eat it. That night, Chef Lim had called in sick at 7 p.m., not a polite sick, but a violently, messily, definitively sick that no one was going to argue with. The pastry section was unmanned. The restaurant was fully booked. Table 7 had ordered dessert 3 times and been told 3 different polite lies about why it was delayed. Table 7 was not a patient table. The head chef, a compact, furious man named Marco who communicated primarily through controlled profanity, had turned to the kitchen and delivered what he likely considered a motivational speech. Anyone. Does anyone in this building know how to make a dessert that won't embarrass me? Silence. Except from Amina, who had been quietly placing clean plates onto the shelf and who said, without looking up, "I have something already made." Marco stared at her. "You." "Yes." "You made a dessert." "Yes." "When?" "Earlier. While I was cleaning." Marco opened his mouth, closed it, looked at the clock, looked at the dessert she was now carrying from the small cold shelf near the back of the prep station. He looked at it the way a desperate man looks at a lifeboat, half grateful, half suspicious. He tasted it. He said nothing for 4 full seconds. Then he said, "Table 7. It went to the wrong table. The server, new, nervous, convinced that table 7 was the corner booth and not the window seat, placed it in front of Jang Dujin. And Dujin ate it. And asked his question. And the kitchen, when the answer finally arrived, went very, very quiet. Dujin waited. He was good at waiting. It was one of the skills his father had deliberately cultivated in him before everything between them had collapsed. Patience, his father used to say, is not passive. It is the most aggressive thing a man can do in a room full of people who want him to react. So Dujin waited while the server went to the kitchen and came back with a man who was clearly the head chef and was clearly uncomfortable. "Mr. Jang." Marco bowed, slightly. "My sincerest apologies for the confusion. The dessert was sent to your table by mistake. If you'd like anything else, I would like to know who made this." Marco's jaw tightened. "Our kitchen team collaborated on." "Marco." Dujin said the name once. Just the name. The way you'd say it to a student who had just lied to a teacher, and both of them knew it. "I have been eating in this restaurant for 2 years. I know every dish on the menu. I know who made each one, and on what night. This dessert has never appeared on any menu. The flavor profile is West African. The honey is raw. The tamarind was prepared from scratch, not from concentrate. Someone in your kitchen made this from a personal recipe, and it was not you, and it was not any chef I have ever seen work this line." He paused. "So, I will ask for the last time. Who made this?" Marco exhaled. "The dishwasher," he said. The table went quiet. One of Dujin's associates made a sound that was almost a laugh but thought better of it at the last second. Dujin looked at the plate. Then he said, "Bring her." Amina was elbow-deep in soapy water when Marco appeared beside her and said, in a tone she had never heard from him before, something approaching respectful, "Mr. Jang wants to speak with you." She turned slowly. "Who?" "The man at the corner table." She didn't know who that was. She knew very little about the restaurant's ownership structure. She knew she had a job and that the job paid rent, and that Samir needed new school shoes, and that she did not ask questions that were not her business. Why, she said. Because he wants to know who made the dessert. Amina dried her hands. She followed Marco through the kitchen. She had never been in the front of the restaurant during service. In 14 months, she had lived entirely in the back, the steam, the clatter, the controlled chaos of the kitchen world. Stepping through the door into the dining room felt like stepping through a membrane into a different country. The lighting was warmer. The noise was softer. The carpet was the color of expensive decisions. The man at the corner table was watching her before she reached him. That was the first thing she noticed. He wasn't glancing up from a phone or from a conversation. He was watching her walk toward him with the focused attention of someone who had already decided to take her seriously, which was unusual. In Amina's experience, most people in this city decided how seriously to take her within the first 2 seconds of seeing her, and the calculation almost never landed in her favor. She stopped at the table.
She did not bow.
She had not done anything wrong.
You made this, he said.
It was not a question. Yes. What is it called? Zuma tamarind cloud. My grandmother's recipe. Where is your grandmother from? Kano, Nigeria. Eugene looked at the plate again, then back at her. Why are you washing dishes? Amina blinked. Of all the questions she had prepared herself for, that was not one of them. Because it is the job I have, she said. It is not the job you should have. She said nothing. She didn't know what to do with a sentence like that, coming from a stranger at a restaurant table at 10 o'clock at night. So she did what she always did when the world said something she hadn't anticipated. She stood still and waited for more information. Can you make this again? He asked. Yes. Tomorrow night? If I have the ingredients. You'll have them. He looked at Marco. Whatever she needs. Marco nodded with the enthusiasm of a man who had narrowly avoided a disaster and was still processing his relief. Amina walked back through the dining room, through the membrane, back into the steam and clatter of the kitchen world. She picked up the next stack of plates. She washed them. She didn't tell anyone what she was feeling, but her hands were shaking slightly. Not from fear. From something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Eugene came back the following night, and the night after that. By the end of the first week, it had become a pattern that the entire restaurant staff had noticed and was carefully pretending not to discuss. He sat at the same table. He ordered the same dessert. And somewhere between the first course and the last, Amina was always brought out, ostensibly to confirm preparation details, actually to talk. They talked the way two people talk when they are both accustomed to being misread and have quietly stopped expecting anything different, carefully at first, then with increasing ease, then in the way that happens when a conversation stops feeling like an exchange and starts feeling like a relief. He asked her about the recipe, about Hajia Rakia, about the tamarind she had spent 3 months sourcing in Los Angeles because the concentrate was a lie she refused to tell the dish. She asked him nothing. She was not in the habit of asking powerful men questions, but he answered things she hadn't asked, which she found more interesting anyway. One evening, without preamble, he said, I want you to make it somewhere else. She looked at him. Somewhere else. I have a gathering at my home this Saturday. 8 people. Business associates, some of whom matter more than others. I want to serve the dessert. I want you to make it there. Amina was quiet for a moment. She understood the practical request. She also understood the other thing underneath it, the way an invitation into someone's home was different from an invitation into their restaurant. The weight of the distinction was not lost on her. You want me to cook in your home, she said. I want you to make your grandmother's recipe in a kitchen that is better equipped than this one. Yes. His tone was even, factual. He was not performing anything. I will compensate you properly. I will send a car for you, and for Samir if he needs to come. She considered it. All right, she said. She told herself it was because the compensation would help. She told herself it was professional. She told herself a great many things on the drive home that night, none of which fully explained why she had agreed before he finished the sentence. Saturday arrived with the particular quality of Los Angeles evenings in early autumn, warm enough to feel like summer hadn't fully conceded, cool enough to remind you it was losing. Eugene's residence was in the hills, a house that announced its wealth through restraint rather than display. Clean lines. Quiet materials. The kind of place that cost an enormous amount of money to look like it wasn't trying. The car arrived for Amina at 4 in the afternoon as promised. Samir sat beside her in the back seat with his knees together and his eyes on the window, taking in the city the way he always did. Not like a child watching something exciting, but like someone filing things away for later use. "You're quiet," Amina said. "I'm thinking," he said. "About what?" "About why a man who owns a restaurant invites the person who washes his dishes to cook in his house." Amina looked at him. Because he tasted the food and wanted more of it. That is the whole story. Samir looked at her with a particular expression he reserved for things he did not believe, but had decided not to argue about. She looked back out the window. The kitchen in Eugene's home was exactly what he had promised, better equipped, more space, a long marble counter that Amina stood at for a moment with her hands resting flat on the surface, simply adjusting to it. The ingredients she had requested had been sourced and arranged with a precision that told her someone had taken the list seriously. Raw honey, not the processed kind. Tamarind pods, not concentrate. Cardamom that had been ground fresh, which she could tell by the smell the moment she opened the container. She began to work. This was the thing about Amina in a kitchen. She became a different version of herself. Not louder, not more expressive, but more settled, more certain. The particular stillness that in the dining room read as guardedness became, in a kitchen, something else entirely. Authority. The kind that doesn't announce itself. Samir sat on a stool at the far end of the counter, doing homework with the focused efficiency of a child who wanted to be done with homework and was not going to pretend otherwise. Occasionally, he looked up and watched his aunt work, and occasionally, he looked toward the corridor that led to the rest of the house, where the low sounds of conversation and music indicated the gathering was already underway. Eugene appeared in the kitchen doorway at 7:30. He paused there for a moment before saying anything, and Amina was aware of the pause without turning around. "How long?" he asked. 20 minutes, she said. He came further into the kitchen. He looked at the counter, at the preparation, methodical, clean, each component at the exact stage it needed to be. "You don't measure," he said. "My grandmother didn't measure. She said the recipe lives in your hands, not in a spoon. And if your hands are uncertain, then the food knows." She glanced at him. "It always knows." He was quiet for a moment, watching. Then his eyes moved to Samir, who had looked up from his homework and was watching Eugene with the particular calibrated attention of a child who has learned to assess adults quickly. "This is Samir," Amina said. "I know," Eugene said. He looked at the boy directly. "Your aunt says you're the sharpest person in every room you walk into." Samir considered this. "She's never said that to me." "She said it to me." A beat. Then Samir looked at Amina, who kept her eyes on her work. He looked back at Eugene. "She doesn't give compliments easily," Samir said. "So I'll take it." The corner of Eugene's mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Adjacent to one. He returned to his guests. The dessert was served at 8:45. Amina plated each portion herself, the way Hajia Rakia had taught her. Not rushed, not precious, but considered. Each plate carrying its intention. She was cleaning the counter when the sound from the dining room changed. It was not a dramatic sound. It was the sound of a conversation pausing, of a room recalibrating. The specific silence that descends when 8 people who talk for a living have simultaneously run out of things to say. Then, after a moment, conversation resumed, but different in texture. Warmer. Slower. The kind that happens when people stop performing and start actually talking. Amina kept cleaning. Samir looked up from his homework. "They liked it," he said. "Yes," she said. "How do you know? You didn't go out." "I can't hear it." She folded the cloth neatly. Food changes the sound of a room when it works. The voices drop. People slow down. She looked at him. "Your great-grandmother taught me that." Samir was quiet for a moment. Then, "Do you miss her?" "Every day. Amina said simply. It was almost 10 o'clock when the kitchen door opened again. Not Dujin this time, but a woman. She was Korean, perhaps 30, and she was beautiful in the deliberate, composed way of women who have spent considerable time and resource making sure of it. Her dress was dark, her jewelry minimal, her posture the kind that came from either excellent breeding or deliberate cultivation. She stood in the doorway looking at Amina with an expression that took a moment to fully read, because it passed through several stages quickly.
Surprise.
Assessment. And then something colder, something that settled behind her eyes like a decision being made. You're the one who made the dessert, she said. Her English was precise, lightly accented. Yes, Amina said. I'm Seo Yun. She said the name the way people say names that are supposed to mean something. Dujin and I are engaged. The word landed in the kitchen with more weight than the woman had perhaps intended. Or exactly as much weight as she intended. It was difficult to tell. Amina held her gaze steadily. Congratulations, she said. Because it was the appropriate word, and she was a woman who used appropriate words. Seo Yun stepped further into the kitchen. Her eyes moved around the space, at the cleaned counter, at the organized remnants of preparation, at Samir on his stool who had gone very still in the way he went still when he was watching something carefully. How long have you been working for Dujin? Seo Yun asked. I work at his restaurant, Amina said. I have been there 14 months. And tonight? He asked me to prepare the dessert for his guests. Seo Yun smiled. It was a beautiful smile that did not reach the part of her face above the cheekbones. He does enjoy collecting interesting things, she said. It's one of his qualities. She paused. He'll lose interest. He always does, once the novelty has worn through. Amina said nothing. She had been in Los Angeles long enough to know which silences were dignified and which were simply afraid. She knew the difference from the inside. This one was dignified. Seo Yun seemed to find the silence unsatisfying. You should understand your position here, she said, her voice dropping to something quieter, more deliberate. Whatever he has told you, whatever attention he has given you, it is not what you think it is. Men like Dujin do not change their plans for women like you. They are entertained by them. Briefly. She tilted her head slightly. I want to make sure that is clear. It is clear, Amina said. Her voice was even. Her hands were still. Something in Seo Yun's composure shifted. Just slightly. The satisfaction she had expected from the exchange had not arrived, and its absence seemed to irritate her more than a reaction would have. She took one step closer. And then she did something that nobody in that kitchen had anticipated. Her hand moved quickly, sharply, and the sound of it filled the kitchen the way sounds like that always do. Too loud, too sudden, bouncing off the hard surfaces of counters and tiles and the stunned silence of the room. The slap landed on Amina's left cheek. Samir was off his stool before the sound had finished echoing. Amina did not move. This was the thing that would stay in everyone's memory afterward. Not the slap itself, but what came after it. Amina stood exactly where she had been standing. She did not raise her hands. She did not step back. She turned her face slowly, with enormous deliberate calm, back to face Seo Yun. Her expression was not rage. It was not tears. It was something quieter and more terrible than either. The look of a woman who has already survived so much that this, in the long ledger of what the world has done to her, registers as one more thing. Seo Yun had expected collapse. Had expected apology, or anger, or fear. The stillness she received instead unsettled her in a way she could not immediately name. You will leave my kitchen, Amina said. Her voice was so quiet it was almost gentle. And this is the moment that stops the room. Not just in that kitchen, but for every person reading this right now who has ever been humiliated in a space where they were simply trying to do their work with dignity. If you've ever had your worth dismissed by someone who thought their position gave them the right, say something in the comments. Not a summary. A truth. Because Amina's silence in that moment cost her something real, and the people who've paid that cost know exactly what it feels like. Subscribe and stay, because what walks through that kitchen door next will change every single thing. Seo Yun's chin lifted. She opened her mouth. The kitchen door opened. Eugene stood in the doorway. He had come to tell Amina that his guests wanted to know if there was more of the dessert, which was the kind of problem he considered a satisfying one. He had walked through the corridor with that purpose and nothing else in his mind. He took in the room in the way he took in most things, completely, immediately, without visible reaction. Samir standing rigid beside the counter. Amina's hand not quite raised to her cheek, then lowering deliberately. The particular stillness of a room in the aftermath of something that cannot be undone. Seo Yun turned to face him. Eugene, she said. Her voice had recovered its composure. I was just introducing myself to your. I saw, he said. 2 words. Very quiet. Seo Yun's composure held. She was practiced at composure. It was one of the qualities that had made her a suitable match in the minds of the people who had arranged this arrangement. She was in the private area of your home. She was in my kitchen, Eugene said. Because I invited her. I understand that, but. Seo Yun. He said her name the way he said all names when a conversation needed to end. Not loudly. With a finality that had nothing to do with volume. We will speak later. The room was very still. Seo Yun looked at him. Then at Amina. Then back at Eugene, and something moved across her face. Not the cold calculation from before, but something rawer underneath it. Something that in a different story might have been worth examining. But this was not that story, and the moment did not expand into it. She left the kitchen without another word. Her footsteps receded down the corridor. Eugene did not move immediately. He stood in the doorway for a moment, and in that moment the kitchen held 3 people and the particular weight of what had just happened and all the things that were not being said. Then he looked at Amina. Are you hurt? He said. It was the same question Amina had asked Samir on a different night, in a different room, and the echo of it was not lost on her.
No, she said.
He did not ask anything else. He did not offer anything elaborate. He simply crossed the kitchen to the counter where the remaining components of the dessert were still arranged and said, quietly, My guests are asking if there's more. And Amina, because she was who she was, because dignity had always expressed itself in her as continuation rather than collapse, turned back to the counter. There is, she said. And she made more. Samir watched his aunt from his stool. He watched her hands move through the preparation the way they always moved, with certainty, with care, with the particular grace of someone who is doing exactly what they were made to do. He watched Eugene stand at the far end of the counter in silence, not leaving, not intruding, just present in the way that some people are present, as a steadying thing rather than a demand. He picked up his pencil. He went back to his homework. But his eyes moved upward twice more before he finished the page, checking the room the way children check rooms when they are not quite ready to stop watching something. Later, after the guests had gone, after the kitchen had been fully cleaned, after Samir had fallen asleep in the car on the way home with his head against the window, Amina sat in the passenger seat in the quiet of the moving car and felt, beneath the evening's accumulated weight, something unexpected. Not anger. She had set that down before it could take root. Not hurt. That too had been placed somewhere. What she felt, in the specific quiet of that car on that night, was a clarity she had not had in a long time. The kind that only arrives after something has tried to diminish you and failed. The cheek still held a faint heat. She did not raise her hand to it. She looked out the window at the lights of Los Angeles moving past, enormous, indifferent, burning steadily, and thought about her grandmother's kitchen, about the wooden stool, about the smell of tamarind and cardamom, about the voice that had told her, at age 11, that food made with intention could not be dismissed, that a woman who knew what she carried could not be made to drop it by someone else's hands. Hajia Rakia had been right about most things. She was right about that too. The car moved through the city. Samir slept. Amina Bello kept her eyes open. Eugene called the following morning. Not a message. Not a representative. Not an email routed through someone whose job it was to manage his communications at a distance. He called directly at 9:15, while Amina was standing in the kitchen of her apartment making tea and Samir was eating cereal and reading something that was definitely not the book he was supposed to be reading for school. She looked at the number on her phone. She answered it. I want to apologize for last night, he said. You didn't do anything, Amina said. I know. That's what I'm apologizing for. A pause. What happened in my kitchen should not have happened. The responsibility for that space and everyone in it belongs to me. Amina was quiet for a moment. Samir had looked up from his not-school book and was watching her with the expression he wore when he was deciding whether to pretend he wasn't listening. I accept the apology, she said. It doesn't require anything further. I'd like to discuss what comes next.
For the dessert program.
For your role. Another pause, shorter. And I want to make sure you understand that last night's situation has been addressed. She did not ask what addressed meant in his vocabulary. She suspected the definition was thorough. I can come to the restaurant this afternoon, she said. I'll send a car at 2. He hung up without ceremony, which she had come to understand was not rudeness, but simply the way he operated. He said what he meant and stopped talking when he was finished. In a city full of people who performed their exits, she found it oddly restful.
Samir put down his not-school book.
That was him. Yes. What did he want? To apologize. Samir considered this. For her? For his kitchen. Another pause. That's an interesting way to take responsibility, Samir said, with the tone of a child who had been thinking about responsibility more than most adults gave him credit for. Yes, Amina agreed. It is. She drank her tea. She did not tell Samir that the phone call had done something to her equilibrium that the slap had not managed. The slap she had known how to hold. This was harder to categorize. The meeting that afternoon was not what Amina had expected. She had expected a brief professional conversation, something about menu integration, about compensation, about the practical architecture of whatever role Dujin had decided to offer her. She had prepared herself for that. She had dressed for it. She had arrived with the particular composure of a woman who has decided in advance not to need anything more than what is offered. What she found instead was that Dujin had arranged a tasting. Not a formal one. Not theatrical. He had asked the kitchen to prepare the base components she would need, and he had cleared the afternoon, and what followed was 3 hours of the most focused professional conversation Amina had experienced in 5 years in this country. He asked her about flavor memory, about how she would translate a recipe built for a family kitchen into something that could be executed consistently across 6 restaurant locations, about what she would refuse to compromise and what she could adapt without losing the soul of it. She answered everything directly. Sometimes she pushed back. Once she told him he was wrong about the honey ratio scaling and explained precisely why, and he listened without interrupting and then said, "You're right," with the uncomplicated ease of a man who did not experience being corrected as a threat. It was, she thought, the most interesting afternoon she had spent in Los Angeles. At the end of it, he slid a folder across the table. She opened it. The compensation figure made her set the folder down and look at him. "That's for the program development," he said. "Before we discuss the leadership role." "This is more than I make in 8 months," she said. "I know what you make," he said. Not unkindly. As a fact. It was not sufficient for what you were doing. This is closer to sufficient. She looked at the number again. She thought about Samir's school shoes. She thought about the nursing recertification fees that lived on a piece of paper she kept in the back of a drawer because looking at it too often made the distance feel wider. She thought about Hajia Rakia's voice saying that a woman who knows what she carries cannot be made to drop it. She closed the folder. "All right," she said. What she did not say because she was Amina Bello, and she had long since stopped announcing her feelings in rooms where they could be used against her, was that something in her chest had shifted. Something that had been braced for years, angled against impact, permanently prepared for the next door to close, had moved, fractionally, toward something that resembled hope. She would not have called it that yet, but it was in the room. What Amina did not know, because Dujin had not told her and would not tell her for some time, was that the folder on the table was the smaller conversation. The larger one had happened that morning. At 7:45 a.m., before he had called Amina, Dujin had sat across from Seo Yun in the drawing room of his residence with the particular quality of stillness he reserved for conversations that needed to be conducted without any performance on either side. Seo Yun had arrived composed. She was always composed. It was her primary armor, and she wore it well. She had begun with context. with explanation, with the careful architecture of a woman who had spent the night constructing a version of events that positioned her behavior as a reasonable response to an unreasonable situation. The dishwasher in the kitchen, the frequency of Eugene's visits to the restaurant, the nature of his attention, which anyone could see had shifted from professional interest into something less categorizable. She had felt, she explained, that the boundaries of their arrangement were being tested. She had reacted. Eugene let her finish. Then he said, "You struck a woman in my home who was working at my invitation." Seo Yun's composure held. I expressed. "You struck her," he said again. Same volume. Same quiet. Just the words, returned to their plainest form. In front of her child. Something flickered behind Seo Yun's eyes. The child had not featured in her reconstruction of the previous evening. Its inclusion now recalibrated something. "I understand you feel," she began. Seo Yun. He leaned forward slightly, not threateningly, with the weight of a man who was about to say something that could not be unsaid and had decided to say it anyway. "I want to be honest with you, because the arrangement between our families has always been framed as a practical one, and I think you deserve the same clarity I would want." He paused. "I have never misled you about the nature of what this is. You know the terms. You know it was constructed for business reasons, not personal ones. I have respected that. I have respected you within it." Another pause. "But what happened last night told me something I needed to know. And what it told me cannot be overlooked because of business arrangements or family expectations, or the inconvenience of the timing." Seo Yun was very still. "What did it tell you?" she said. It was not quite a question. That when you feel threatened, you reach for the person you believe has the least protection. He sat back. "That is not a woman I can build anything with. Not a business arrangement. Not a household. Not anything." The room was quiet. Outside, Los Angeles was doing what Los Angeles always did, moving, sprawling, indifferent. Inside, in the particular stillness of this room, Seo Yun's composure did something it rarely did. It slipped. Just for a moment. Just enough to show what was underneath, not villainy, not calculation, but something more human and more complicated. A woman who had spent her entire life in rooms where her value was contingent on performance, where composed was the only acceptable register, where the threat of replacement was so constant and so unspoken that it had shaped her responses in ways she had never been asked to examine. Eugene saw it. He was not unmoved by it. But he also did not unsay what he had said. "The arrangement," he continued, "will be unwound carefully and without public damage to anyone. I will speak to both families. I will take responsibility for the dissolution. You will not be made to look like the party at fault in any conversation I have or any account I give." He met her eyes. "You have my word on that." Seo Yun looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, very quietly, "You're in love with her." Eugene did not answer immediately. "I barely know her," he said. "That's not what I asked." The silence that followed was its own answer, which both of them understood, and neither of them addressed directly. Seo Yun stood. She smoothed her dress. She recollected her composure from wherever it had briefly gone and returned it to its proper position, and by the time she reached the door she looked, to any outside observer, like a woman who had simply finished a meeting and was moving on to the next thing. At the door she paused. "She's remarkable," Seo Yun said, without turning around. "Whatever else I think, and I think several things, she is remarkable. Any fool can see it." A beat. "I hope you don't take too long to deserve her." She left. Eugene sat alone in the drawing room for several minutes. Then he picked up his phone and called Amina. Now pause here for just a moment. Because what Eugene just did in that room, ending a powerful family arrangement, absorbing the consequences alone, protecting the reputation of the woman who wronged Amina, that is not a small thing. That is a man choosing character over convenience, at significant personal cost. And we want to know what you think. Was he right to dissolve the engagement? Or did he move too fast, too hard, over one moment? Take a side in the comments. This community does not shy away from honest conversation. And if you are not yet subscribed, this is the moment. Not because we are asking. Because people who think this deeply deserve a space that holds them. News in a restaurant kitchen travels the way water travels, through every crack, along every surface, finding its way into rooms that seem completely sealed. By Wednesday, the story had moved through Oro Nero's staff with the thoroughness of something that had been added to the water supply. The telling varied depending on who was telling it. In the version that circulated among the line cooks, Dujin had thrown Seo Yun out of the house personally, and she had left in tears. In the version that reached the servers, it was more measured but no less satisfying. A conversation, a conclusion, a very expensive engagement being quietly unwound. In Marco's version, which he delivered to the sous chef over espresso with the gravity of a man reporting significant geopolitical events, Seo Yun had slapped Amina, Dujin had found out, and the fallout was still descending. What all versions agreed on was the essential shape of it. And what all versions did with that shape was hold it up and examine it from various angles, the way people examine things that confirm something they suspected but couldn't prove. Amina, for her part, said nothing. She came to work. She did her job. She had begun spending 2 hours each morning in the kitchen developing variations of the dessert program, testing textures, adjusting components, building a document of preparation standards that could be followed by pastry chefs across 6 locations, without losing what made the original irreplaceable. She was good at it. Better than good. She approached it with the same systematic care she had once applied to patient charts, building from evidence, testing assumptions, refusing to accept a result simply because it was close enough. Marco had started bringing her espresso in the mornings without being asked, which was, for Marco, essentially a declaration of profound respect. "You know people are talking," he said one morning, setting the cup beside her prep notes. "I know," she said. "Does it bother you?" She considered it genuinely, which he appreciated because she never gave unconsidered answers. "What bothers me," she said, "is when people's stories about me replace the actual me. But I have found that continuing to simply be yourself is the most effective response to that." Marco looked at her for a moment. "That's either very wise or very exhausting."
"Both," she said.
"Always both." He nodded, satisfied, and went back to his station. It was Samir who noticed it first. He noticed most things first, which Amina had long since accepted as simply the nature of the child she was raising. He had come to the restaurant on Thursday afternoon. School had released early, and the arrangement with the night manager still held, and he had been sitting in the break room for approximately 40 minutes before he appeared in the kitchen doorway with an expression that Amina recognized as the precursor to an observation she was not going to be able to dismiss. "He watches you," Samir said. Amina kept her eyes on her work. "Who?" "Mr. Zhang." Samir came to sit on his customary stool. "Not the way people watch things they're curious about. The way they watch things there." He paused, searching for the word with the precision he applied to words. "Concerned about. Like he's checking that you're still there." "You're 10, Amina said. "You're reading things into." "I'm accurate," Samir said, without heat, as a simple correction of the record. "You know I'm accurate." She did know that. It was one of the inconvenient things about him. She said nothing further. But her hands had stilled for just a moment over the counter before resuming their work, and Samir, who noticed most things, noticed that too and said nothing about it, because he was also the kind of child who understood that some observations were better kept as internal data. On Friday evening, Dujin came to the restaurant. This was not unusual. What was unusual was that he came alone, without associates, without the gravitational field of business that typically surrounded him. He sat at his table and ordered dinner, and when the dessert arrived, he did not send for Amina immediately. He waited until the restaurant had nearly emptied. Then he appeared in the kitchen doorway himself, which he had never done before, and the effect on the remaining kitchen staff was immediate and involuntary. Everyone found a reason to be somewhere else with impressive speed. Marco, to his credit, managed a dignified exit rather than an outright sprint. Dujin leaned against the counter across from Amina. "I want to tell you something," he said. She kept working. She had learned that continuing to work during difficult conversations kept her steady. "All right," she said. "The situation with Seo Yun has been resolved. The arrangement between our families is being dissolved." I want you to hear it from me directly, and not through whatever version of it has already reached you through this kitchen. Amina set down what she was holding. She turned to look at him properly. Why are you telling me? She said. He met her eyes. Because what happens next, if anything happens next, I wanted to begin with clarity, not with things unsaid underneath it. The kitchen was warm. The smell of tamarind and cardamom was in the air, the way it always was now when she was here after hours, which was itself a change. The night manager's informal arrangement had quietly evolved into something more formal, more acknowledged, without anyone having sat down and decided it. You dissolved a business arrangement, she said carefully. Because of what happened in your kitchen. No, he said. I dissolved it because it was already wrong. What happened in the kitchen confirmed something I had been avoiding confirming.
He paused.
I am not a man who avoids things indefinitely. Amina looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the nursing degree in the back of her drawer, about the 5 years of Los Angeles, about all the times she had made herself smaller to fit inside a space that was not built for her, about Hajia Rakia's kitchen and the wooden stool and the recipe that had lived in her hands all this time, waiting. She thought about Seo Yun's hand on her face. She thought about Dujin's voice afterward. I saw. I am not a simple situation, Amina said. I have a child who is not my child but is entirely my child. I have a career I am rebuilding from the ground. I have a life that is still being constructed, and it will not be paused or set aside for anyone. She held his gaze steadily. I want you to know all of that before anything else is said. I know all of that, he said. Knowing it and understanding what it means are different things. I understand what it means, he said. And the way he said it, without qualification, without the slight hedge that people add when they want credit for an intention they haven't fully tested yet, made something in her chest shift again. That same fractional movement from earlier in the week. She picked up what she had set down. She went back to work. But something in the kitchen's atmosphere had changed, the way atmospheres change when something unspoken has been spoken and cannot be walked back. Not dramatically. Not with any theater. Just differently than before. 20 minutes, she said, without looking up. For the dessert, he asked. For the new variation I've been testing. She kept working. You can stay if you want to taste it. He stayed. He sat on Samir's stool at the end of the counter, which somehow suited him despite the fact that it was a stool designed for a 10-year-old, and he watched her work in silence. Not the uncomfortable silence of two people avoiding something. The other kind. The kind that only exists between people who have reached a sufficient understanding that they no longer need to fill the air between them with noise. The variation was ready at 10:20. She plated it herself and placed it in front of him. He tasted it. She watched him the way she watched everyone who tasted her food, carefully, without performance, reading the response before any words arrived. What crossed his face was not the polite appreciation of a man eating something good. It was something less managed than that. Something that moved through his expression and left it slightly different than before, quieter, more open, the way faces look when something has reached a place that's usually closed. He set the spoon down. He looked at her. What did you change? He asked. The intention, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Your grandmother's thing. What you put in before you start. Yes. What was the intention tonight? She looked at him across the counter. The kitchen warm around them. Los Angeles burning outside the high window, enormous and indifferent as always. Hope, she said simply. The word sat between them in the warm air. Dujin looked at the plate for a long moment. Then he looked back at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, unguarded in a way that she suspected very few people ever saw, and that she understood, without needing to be told, was not given easily or often. It tastes exactly right, he said. Outside, in the narrow corridor just beyond the kitchen door, Samir sat with his back against the wall and his knees pulled up to his chest. He had come back from the bathroom 10 minutes ago and had stopped outside the door when he heard the particular quality of silence from within, the kind that told him this was not his room to walk into yet. He sat. He waited. He was just a 10-year-old boy sitting in a corridor, listening to the warm sounds of a kitchen where his aunt was finally being seen. And if this story reached something in you, if Amina's quiet strength, her refusal to collapse, her willingness to hope again after everything this city took from her, touched something you have been carrying, then you already know what to do. This is not a community built for passive watching. It is built for people who have lived enough to recognize truth when it sits down across from them. Subscribe because you belong here. Comment because your story matters. And come back for the next one because the best of what we do together is still ahead.